best ever listeners? Welcome to the best ever CRE podcast. I'm your host, Joe Cornwell, and today I'm joined by Andy Wyman. Andy is a lawyer with the Wyman Legal Solutions partnership, and they are based in Florida, focused mainly on real estate construction law. So today we are going to dive into all of those things and more. First time on the show, Andy, welcome. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks, Joe. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So as I mentioned, it sounds like your background is in construction-related real estate law. So before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit more about you, where are you from, and then how did you get into being a lawyer?
Yeah, absolutely. Our firm is in Boca Raton, Florida, and I've been living in Florida for about 25 years now. But I originally grew up in Long Island in New York, a family of contractors. My dad was a contractor, my grandfather as well. And when I was 13, I went to work in the family business for a summer as a carpenter's assistant, which just meant some poor schmuck had to drag around the boss's son for a little while all summer and make me look useful. But I knew from there I wasn't, surviving with a hammer in my hand. That was for sure. But construction was something that was always interesting to me. Yeah, it was always interesting to me and fascinating. What I love about the actual practice of construction law is not only are we involved in the law, obviously, but it's an opportunity to really learn about all the different facets of what goes into, constructing a building or home or whatever, from understanding how roofing systems work to stucco systems to everything that runs the gamut. So it's every case is different than the next, and we represent owners, we represent contractors, subcontractors, suppliers. So we're kind of on all sides of it.
Very good. That all makes sense to me. And I mentioned briefly before we started today that my background was in value add real estate, and if you're unfamiliar with any of the real estate jargon, please feel free to ask questions. But, what we and our listeners consider value add real estate is when you buy properties that need a lot of work, right? And that was kind of the context of how I got into buying rental properties. I looked for things that need a lot of work, and I started out kind of, DIY and doing a lot of work myself. And then as things got a little bit bigger scale and there were some things I didn't feel comfortable with, I started hiring contractors. So as I mentioned to you, one of my first experiences in real estate was hiring a bad contractor. And he was actually a referral from a friend of mine, and simultaneously kind of ended up scamming both of us at the same time after having a good track record with my friend, which ultimately led to obviously a lot of painful lessons, but also into me kind of building out my own general contracting company. And so obviously all these things we're going to talk about today are near and dear to my heart. But as I mentioned, I've kind of been on both sides of the fence. I've been a customer in a bad situation, and I've been a contractor that's been obviously in good and bad situations as well. So I'm looking forward to picking your brain on all of that and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that whole relationship between an owner and a contractor is, it's fascinating. I mean, there's so much that goes into, having a successful project. It usually all starts with communication, no matter which side of it, you're on. And, as it turns out, I've represented certainly, investors who were kind of in the infancy, right, of their business of real estate investing, of flipping, of rehabbing and value add, as you mentioned, and they get caught sometimes, when they don't seek out the professional help that's going to hopefully lead them to a successful project. And so a lot of learning, real life experiences, and expensive education for sure.
Okay, and so how many years have you been in this business?
Wow. So I graduated law school in 1996, so I'm going on almost my 30th year as a practicing attorney. Like I said, I've been in Florida for about 25 of those years, and I've been doing construction as part of my practice for almost all 25 of those years, and as exclusively my practice for about the last 12.
Okay. So obviously you've seen a ton of these scenarios that we've described and we'll be talking about today. So before we get into any maybe specifics, why don't we look at some generalities? So what are, maybe 3 or 5 things that come to mind that are so common and frequent in your practice, common mistakes that, let's say, homeowners make first? Let's start with that.
Sure. So usually if a homeowner is coming to us after a project has gone incredibly sideways on them, they've usually made 2 big mistakes. One is that they don't really know how to vet and hire a good contractor in the first place. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know how to vet and do background searches. They don't really know where to look to find the information that's out there to hire the right guy and not the wrong guy. And they tend to ignore certain red flags, which I could talk about in a second. But the second problem is that they generally don't sign a contract that protects them if they've signed one at all. And so, by the time they come to me, if they haven't signed anything, it's going to be really difficult for, a good construction attorney like we have here to really help them out if they haven't, taken the steps to have a good contract on the front end.
Okay. Well, all right, before we get into some of your recommendations for
Hmm.
those types of cases, why don't we talk about some of the red flags you just mentioned?
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's all about as I said before, communication really. And so, don't ignore your gut when you're having these conversations with a contractor and who it is you're looking to hire, who's going to be in a residential context in your home while you may be continuing to live through whatever the renovation might be. Really pay attention to how well this person communicates with you and whether or not they are simply enough keeping their promises, right? I mean, down here in Florida, there's a lot of bad contractors. There's a lot of good ones, but there's a lot of bad ones. And the joke down here is kind of, well, if you show up when you say you're going to show up, you're likely to get the job awarded to you. And sad but true. I mean, that is
Yeah.
really kind of how some people make their hiring decision. Well, this is the guy who actually showed up, but it really
Yes.
underscores the bigger problem, right? If someone is going at a point where they're trying to impress you and sell you on using them as being your contractor, if they promise they're going to show up at 5 o'clock and, now it's 5:30 at 6 o'clock and you haven't heard from them, how you do anything is how you do everything, I believe. And that is
Yeah.
how they're going to treat communicating with you during your project as well. It's so easy to just pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm running a little late. I'll be 10 minutes late. And we all understand that and appreciate the communication of being given a heads up. So having, those sort of communication failures is, a big red flag that you should really pay attention to because it's not going to get any better once the contractor has some of your money.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lessons that I think back on my experiences on both sides, and one thing that comes to mind, and I want to get your thoughts on this, but let me kind of lay out, a premise here.
Yeah.
What I've often found with customers of all types of construction, whether this is just homeowner, which we do some of that, just regular kitchen, bathroom, basement, whatever, repairs. A lot of times, it seems customers aren't actually going out and finding or necessarily even looking for the right type of contractor. And what I mean by that is, I kind of break it up into different categories, but at the very base level, you kind of have a guy in a truck, right? Or a girl in a truck, meaning she's solo operator, they do all their own work. They do all their own business. Maybe they have a helper, who's kind of like an unskilled helper or something like that. But that's kind of your baseline, handy man, handy woman, whatever you want to call it. And the reason why that matters is because there's probably not a lot of sophistication. There's not a lot of systems. There's not a lot of, you're probably not going to sign a contract with this person and things like that. You move up to the next, then you might have, a guy who maybe runs a crew. Okay. And I'm going to say guy generically. Obviously, there are women contractors, so I don't want to make it sound like it's an entirely male dominated field, but it is predominantly male dominated. But anyway, all that to be said, you might have a guy with a handful of employees. Maybe their employees are subcontractors, and that's kind of like your next step up. So I want to call it maybe like a crew, contract with crew. The next step up from there is probably more where my company would fall in, where maybe there are systems in place. You have some overhead, you have equipment, you have vehicles, you have employees, you have administrative people, but they're like more of that mid to upper level renovation. So they could do a whole home, or they could do various subcontractors could do roofing or siding or whatever, right? Various aspects of construction. And then from there, to me, the kind of the next two steps would be like really high level, like custom remodelers, where they're doing, probably minimum $150,000, $200,000 renovations and up, or your home builders, right? Then you have your kind of spec and custom home builders, which are, we don't necessarily need to spend a ton of time on today. But really, what I found is with those kind of lines of thoughts, a lot of times people are just going after the wrong contractor in the beginning. So maybe they're calling my company because they want to, change out a toilet. And that's not really what we do. And then even if we do it, or maybe there's a relationship there, so we try to accommodate them, there can be this misalignment of goals and expectations and costs and all and everything else, because they're not even starting the process with the right person. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that whole kind of premise.
I think it is kind of a blind item for a lot of people picking a contractor because they don't really understand, some of what you're just describing. They don't understand what what's really correct for their situation. They don't even really know what they want sometimes. So it's, and the owners, some of the owners are just not very educated as to this process and what's involved and all of the forethought that really should go into having a successful project. Before they pick up a phone to a contractor, they should have a general idea really of what they want. They should have done some homework. They should have an idea of their budget, all of that. And sometimes they go into it kind of blind and they're looking to be educated or led by whatever contractor they call. So, and I think on the one hand, you get those folks who do overshoot, right? They're calling you when it's something that is really you're kind of too maybe big or for what they're looking for. But the undershooting as well, where they're really kind of shopping really on price, right? More than anything else, and not really focus so much on the professionalism, the structure, the business, the systems, the people they have, and all that. And that does make a big difference when you're dealing with just, let's say, the one guy in a van. That's the kind of service you're going to get, and it's going to be at a different price point, but you get what you pay for sometimes.
Yeah, and that, and I try to teach newer investors and people who are scaling up in real estate, whether they're doing larger projects or maybe multiple projects at a time, starting to do some of that volume. You have to be really intentional about who you want to hire, because one thing I've learned being in the business the last 8 years is that more often than not, everybody's going to tell you they can do everything, right? Very rarely are you going to call a contractor who wants to make money and you're going to offer them a job or ask them about a job or ask for an estimate on a job. And they're going to just be like, no, we don't do it. No, I don't want to do it. That's rare. That's fair. And that's throughout that whole spectrum I laid out, right? More often than not, people are going to want to take your money if it makes sense to. But to your point, I think the listeners and the homeowners and the people who are not involved in this day-to-day business like you and I are, who maybe don't understand some of this nuance we're breaking down, they have to really try to understand what they want. Because if budget is the most important thing, then maybe having that handy person in a truck, single operator, maybe they have a helper, whatever, that may be your best bet. But keep in mind that more often than not, if you're the homeowner and that's the person you're hiring, you're going to kind of have to babysit them. You're almost GCing your own project in a way, because they don't have the people, the systems in place to manage a project. So you're going to manage them. But you have to understand that going in, or you're going to be disappointed. But that's probably the best way to get the value. Or another thing we could even talk about is like finding specializations within construction, because if you're calling me to do drywall, yes, we have a drywall crew, but if I'm managing my own drywall crew, that's obviously going to come with a premium because I'm GCing the crew, right? So you're paying for that overhead and you're paying for that margin that goes on top of our cost. Where if you can find a guy that just knows how to do drywall and pay them directly, or maybe they have a buddy that can help, whatever, obviously you're going to get kind of down to really the labor force, which is going to, of course, be the lowest cost, but comes with other complications that we could talk about.
And I think, especially when you get into, sort of the building up of a real estate investment business, kind of like you described, right, where you start sort of as a DIY, and then maybe you kind of, are able to hire somebody, but you're kind of managing them, like you said.
Yes.
But when you get to the point of a certain level of sophistication, and now it's really just you're trying to be hands off in that regard, and you're leaving it to professionals to perform and do it efficiently and do it quickly, so you could turn the property or whatever you are looking to do. I mean, that is that's kind of how there is sort of a graduation that happens, to those better levels of contractor, which comes more full service. But
Yes,
hey, there is still, and especially if this is real estate investing might be a side thing for some people, and
right.
we'll have doctors that are clients who they're doing that kind of on the side, but they've got full medical practices. I mean, they don't have the time to babysit a contractor, so having some person, a good contractor is obviously important, and having an owner's representative, a construction manager of your own, someone who can oversee a project for you and be your eyes and ears and make sure the contractor is performing like they're supposed to, is another also important component of some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of the fundamental question, and we talk about that a lot within the real estate circles, but it's like, how much is your time? Because if you're trying to go direct to the labor, if you're trying to go direct to the labor force, then you are cutting out the overhead and the margin and the general contracting side of it. But as a homeowner or a property owner, now you are doing that role. Like that is what, alternatively do you pay for? if you don't have the expertise or the time or the patience to deal with that. And it may sound great saving money because that's, again, like you mentioned, that's how I started. I'm bringing in direct laborers to work under me. It's a lot of headaches. And then also at that level, when you're talking about going straight to like an hourly type of contractor, maybe you're going to pay for all the mistakes. Like they're not going to pay for the mistakes. So there's something to keep in mind with that as well. But the reason why I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of prefacing this discussion is that so often it seems that just the step one in this process is it can go off the rails by just picking the wrong type of contractor, wrong company, et cetera. So obviously I think we've covered that and can kind of move on to the next steps in the process.
We say that all the time. I mean, the first couple of decisions you make in this process can totally doom your project. And
Absolutely.
who you decide to do the project with is the most important decision you're going to make. And that's, if you make the wrong decision, it's tough to rebound.
Okay, so let's maybe frame this with some hypotheticals here that you can
Sure.
kind of break down what you would give your advice to a client. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously we can extrapolate these ideas and these lessons to any project, big, small,
Yep.
commercial, residential, whatever. Right. So let's
Mm-hmm.
say I want to do a large addition to my home. Okay, and we just covered step one. So let's say I find the right types of contractors. So I'm getting estimates from people that are in that wheelhouse. They've done additions. They have a track record. They're vetted to an extent. From there, how would you advise your clients to go about actually selecting the right company to work with in that case?
So, first and foremost, and you hear this all the time, obviously you want somebody who's properly licensed, properly insured, and that they're going to pull permits, right? So,
Yes.
especially I know with, certain times real estate investors, they're looking to get in and out quick, and they kind of skip over the permit part of it. And, I certainly don't encourage that at all. But, there is a lot of information out there that is publicly available on contractors, that if you know where to look. And in Florida, you have a construction company, but licenses are given to people, individuals, right? And so there's always a person who qualifies the business, who is the license holder. There's resources to go to, at least here, with the state, as far as confirming their licensing, seeing if there's been license complaints or against the company and the individual. Take a look at. I know it may sound basic, but look at all of their online reviews, right? So
Mm.
they'll usually be a lot of good ones, but if you see that a lot of bad ones have been happening recently, and that more recently, it tends to be sort of a predictor of some financial difficulties that a contractor might be having, because they're
Mm.
starting to either spread themselves too thin, they're not satisfying their current customers, they're probably leaving a bunch of them hanging as they just keep signing up new business, and they're focusing on the new folks with the bigger checks and not finishing out jobs. And so, it tends to demonstrate that they're having some sort of problems. There's always, checking the clerk's offices for lawsuits that they're involved in. And you do want to get references and speak to other people they've done work for. And that those are going to be the successful projects, right? But there are things that you can ask to even those people that, you're not just going to say, how is it working with them, right? But you want to really get into a lot of detail, especially if you're going to be living in, if it's a home and it's an addition and you're going to be living through this thing. I mean, you want to know, how well their folks are vetted. Are there people
Mm.
that are going to be on the project that speak English, that you can
Mm.
communicate with, whatever your language is, right? Are you going to have someone dedicated to manage it? If I need to speak to somebody, who is it that is dedicated that I can talk to, and a whole bunch of other things. Did they protect your floors before they started, dragging stuff out of there? Did they clean up at the end of the day? Are they leaving
Mm.
nails and screws around for your kid, your toddler to pick up? So like there's a lot of other things you can ask and find out about to see that the way they work jives well with the way you like things done. And then again, it's communication, how well they're communicating and how well you relate to this person. And keep in mind also, lots of times, this is like, let's say it's a husband and a wife that are, hiring somebody to come in their house and do work. And I've seen contractors that treat the husband much differently than they treat the wife, right?
Mm.
It's unfortunately, it can be a little bit of a chauvinistic industry sometimes. And I've seen situations where the wives, especially if you're the husband, you're working, and if your wife is the one who you've agreed is going to stay home to watch over what's happening. You want to you got to be careful about who you've got in there, because they can some of these contractors tend to can mistreat the women, unfortunately, and think that they can kind of run over them and bully them a little bit, and we see that quite a bit. So it's a lot of that kind of stuff that is really kind of how you would make a decision, let's say between two, and also take a look at what they're. Again, are they delivering things to you on time like they said they would? Did they get you the proposal on time? Or if they were going to be late, did they at least tell you in advance it was going to be late? What's the professionalism of what they're presenting you with, right? If you see a document that they're giving you, let's say it's their draft of a contract or their terms and conditions, and there's misspellings and inconsistencies, the numbering is off, the margins are off, like it tells you how much they respect or don't respect their contract and what they're promising to do. And it's like I said, how you do anything is how you do everything. If that's the kind of detail that they're paying attention to, that level to that document, I think there's going to be an issue when to the level of detail they're going to be they think will be acceptable in your work. So these are the sorts of things I would encourage people to really pay attention to.
That's great. There's so many things in here I want to touch on. Okay, so let me start with the license part. Okay, because this is such a misnomer. Almost everybody I talk to doesn't understand how this works and why and what. And I will say before we discuss it, obviously this is a national and even international listener base. It's going to vary drastically on what state and what county and what local jurisdiction you're in.
Right.
And so obviously you need to do your own research where you live in your market or where you're investing. But generally speaking, with the licensing stuff, a general contractor's license is typically what people call a license that allows you to operate a construction business. And that is going to vary drastically state by state. I'm based in Ohio. Ohio is still one of those states that has no licensing requirements at all for a general contractor. The only licensing we have here is if it's specific trade license. So you have an electrical license, which there's levels of. There's a plumbing license, which there's levels of. So you have like apprentice, journeyman, master, etc. for both of those. And then HVAC, where there's actually a couple different levels, where there is a kind of a lower level, which is an EPA, which is a federal certification, which allows you to buy all of the equipment and the coolant that is controlled and regulated by the EPA. And then there's a state level license, which allows you to buy certain equipment and apply to get actually certified within the specific trade brands like Carrier or Train. Some of the large name brands require specific certifications within them to sell and service their products, right? So that's another kind of caveat within the HVAC business. The reason why all that matters is because when you're dealing with a general contracting company like mine, I personally, as the owner, as one of the partners in my company, I don't hold any license at all. So we have employees and we have subcontractors who work under our company and under our insurance, which is a whole nother issue we could talk about, where they have individual trade license. And so we work with them on projects, especially large scale projects, where they are pulling permits under their license. And then we are, they and their employees and our employees are operating under that license for particular work of that permit. So I just want to preface all that. And again, that can vary drastically. I'm sure you're in Florida, probably slightly different. I think you mentioned there is a general contractor license in Florida now. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's actually multiple. There's building contractors, residential building contractors. So yeah, there's a few different levels of it. Yeah.
And so one thing that I've seen happen just in the 8 years I've been in business, individual jurisdictions, right? So I'm based near Cincinnati, Ohio. So we work in kind of Southwest Ohio. The city of Cincinnati Metro has a registration for a general contractor license within the city. So if you want to operate, that is an annual renewal, and that is something we do carry. But just so people understand what something like that might look like, that is something where you get vetted on a background check and an insurance check. So your insurance carrier has to demonstrate, adequate levels of insurance for your company, which covers your subcontractors and your general liability. Sometimes they require workers' comp, depending on the type of insurance, and the city approves that, and then you can get renewed and have a registration as a licensed general contractor. But that is not a state license. So if you go outside of the city limits in Ohio and most typical suburbs or more rural areas, especially, you can operate basically with impunity. And then really even in carrying insurance is something that'd be up to you and your customer if that's a requirement for them. But anyway, I just want to try to explain that because I feel like most people do not understand the nuance that can come with trade licenses, general contractor license, and unfortunately, it does vary drastically, even within counties in your state. So,
Point
um,
for sure.
okay, let's talk a little bit about permits. So,
Hmm.
I know you briefly touched on that. Obviously, my assumption with you being an attorney is your default position is you should always get a permit whenever it's required. What are your other thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean that is always going to be my default position. I mean, look, I think that what's important to understand is if you don't get a, at least here in Florida, again, if you don't get a permit or you do work to your property that's not permitted and you go to sell this property, there is a disclosure obligation under the law to disclose to someone buying your property anything that's material or that would affect the value of it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so look, and if you're comfortable telling somebody that, hey, here's work we did, it didn't have a permit. And the person buying the property is comfortable with that, then it's really, it's not really a big deal. Now, here, doing work without a permit that requires one is technically a code violation that runs with the property. There could be a point in the future where whoever owns the property at whatever time, the municipality learns of the problem and wants to stick it to you. Now you're going to have to deal with that and then try to, deal with work that was done without a permit and retroactively try to get one. It might require you to dismantle some work or something. But so that's always going to be my, certainly my default position, and I think what that also does is again, here, because we have all these different licenses, it requires that, the work that's being done is going to be performed by somebody who is licensed to do it because they're pulling the permit. Unless we also get down here unlicensed people and then licensed people who are pulling permits. So the
Yes.
unlicensed people could do the work. That's rampant down here.
Oh yeah.
And that's, that's stuff that we see all the time and trying to help some clients.
Yeah, and I think I have a little different perspective on it. I will say, generally speaking, if you were doing a large project, if you were doing a project with substantial structural, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, HVAC changes, my default recommendation would be to get a permit or pursue the permitting process.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that the reality of the situation is that's not always the case. That doesn't always happen. I will also say that depending, again, kind of talking about my market, there are some kind of really asinine draconian rules. Like, for example, the city limits, the metro city limits of Cincinnati, they require a plumbing permit every time you change a plumbing fixture. So you could, technically, I'm not saying people do that, but I'm just saying that on the books, technically, if I were to change out my faucet in my sink and get a new one, I go to Home Depot, I buy $100 faucet, I change it out myself, whatever, hopefully it takes 30 minutes. Technically, I should have went down to the county or the city office, paid however much, probably is the same amount of money for a permit, had it inspected, right? So it's like the reality of it is are people really going to do this? No. So now, not to say that no one ever does, and I've actually had inspectors who required us to do that, even on just literally like a fixture change. But the reason why I give that kind of extreme example is because I think if we're going to have an honest discussion, there's a sweet spot, right? Where I think most reasonable people would agree that permits become not only a requirement but logical to do so. So you kind of really, you have to, as a homeowner, as the customer of any contracting job, you have to decide where that is, because there's certainly contractors and companies out there who don't care about doing permits. We've done projects without permits, but we never advocate for a customer to not use a permit. Let's put it that way. We try to explain the rules. We explain the consequences, both for us and them, if there is unpermitted work. And we typically let the customer decide. If I'm just being totally honest, with the listeners on how it actually works in the real world, at least in my market.
Yeah, well, I think that's an appropriate way to handle it. The permit rules down here are a bit different, and so you don't need a permit for every little thing like that. But if you're going to move a fixture, if you're going to reroute the plumbing, then yes, you should put you have a permit requirement. But yeah, and I think we run into a lot of situations where I have homeowners who say they didn't know they needed a permit, and I wasn't told, and no one ever mentioned it to me. Again, that's part of, I think, also the education process. Like, if you're a homeowner and you're doing work, you should educate yourself on what is required. Don't always trust that the contractor is going to tell you everything, or rely only on the contractor to educate you. It's important to understand that.
Yeah, and if I'm putting myself in the homeowner's shoes or the customer's shoes,
Hmm.
right? It's
Hmm.
if I have a contractor or company who is really pressing me to not get a permit on something, that would be a red flag because
Yeah.
it tells me there's a couple things, right? Either they're trying to bid this so cheap that they can't do this with permitted work because the cost would be as such that they maybe not win or would likely not be able to compete to win this job, or they do not have the qualified people or the right credentials to go out and actually get a permit. Again, a lot of this hopefully is common sense, and you have to kind of make judgment calls. But I'm sure you see a lot of cases that, in hindsight, common sense was not used.
Oh, all the time, all the time, and and it becomes, on both sides. Common sense was not used by the owner, some or the contractor, and it's when it finally hits them after the fact, they're kicking themselves always. I can't believe that this happened to me, and yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so
yeah,
you covered license, covered permits. I did
hmm,
want to touch a little bit on the sexism thing. It's so interesting that you say that, and I'm a millennial. Maybe from a younger generation. Than I'm going to make the assumption that historically this was probably a bigger problem than it hopefully is
hmm,
today. I'm gonna hope that we're moving in the right direction with that issue.
right,
But
yeah,
it's what stood out to me is like I feel like at least the way my company operates is like almost the exact opposite. And the reason why I say, and I'm not saying it's some virtue
hmm,
signaling thing. It's like more often than not when we're talking about retail homeowner jobs, the wife or the woman of the house is typically the decision maker. That's been my experience the last 8 years. While I think you mentioned, hey, maybe the wife stay at home, maybe she doesn't work, so maybe the male counterpart of the spouse is the one, who's kind of the handling the money side of it, which I think was kind of your point. It's like more often than not, in my experience, the women are making the decision. They're picking design. They're the point of contact for a lot of projects, especially if they're in the home. If they work from home, maybe they stay at home with the kids, whatever it may be. But the point of all that, should hopefully just be common sense to any of the contractors or construction people listening. You want to keep that person really happy because that is your point of contact and that is your decision maker. Because if they're happy, the spouse is probably happy as well. So it was just
yeah.
funny. I almost take like the exact opposite viewpoint of that same issue.
Right. Well, that's I understand that for sure. And a lot of it is just it's personalities. A lot of it is just sort of how you probably deal with people generally. And
Yeah.
so I think and that tends to just come out in the on the business end of it, especially if tensions start to get a little high. The owners are trying not to maybe pay you what you think you're ready to get paid because they're not
Mm.
happy with. So and as that starts to escalate, I guess it can boil over a little bit.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of these
Mm,
things, including I want to talk a little bit more about contracts and things that you would
mm,
recommend. Um, so let's do that first, and then I
sure.
want to shift over to maybe some of your advice for any contractors, builders, or construction related people who may be listening to this. But
Great.
let's start with the contract piece. What is your
Hmm.
general thoughts on contracts? Should you use them? When should you use them? And what should they generally
Hmm.
look like?
Yeah. So in my mind, I mean, a contract, is going to clearly set forth a scope of work, the price, payment terms. As the job gets a little more expensive, as the job gets a little more complicated, and and maybe is expected to last 4, 5, 6 months or longer because it's that type of work. It's you need to kind of add a little more into it because you're going to have multiple payment points. You're going to have Florida is a state where there's lien laws, right? And people who do work on property, whether it's a contractor or a sub, I mean, they can put liens on homes if they don't get paid. So there's certain paperwork that the owner is going to want to know that they're going to get when they exchange payments to the contractor. So that sort of stuff should get written in. And really kind of it's always good to have in a contract some type of, cheap, quick dispute resolution process, right?
Mm,
Like you don't really want to go from 0 to 100 where, if, okay, there's a termination and now we're suing or arbitration. Like you want some way to resolve a dispute, preferably on site. And especially as you get into the bigger projects, commercial projects, I mean, those contracts tend to be more, the things you see like from the AIA or, certain other organizations where there's really, they've thought of like everything, and there's really, and getting some contract that helps you get through the project and gets it administered efficiently and in fairness to everybody is really best for both sides, right? You don't want something so onerous that the contractor can't make his
yeah.
money, or that I mean, it needs to be fair to everybody so that the job moves forward. You don't want to drive too hard of a bargain, so to speak, as an owner, because then the contractor's not going to make the money and they're going to lose interest in the job.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of apply this to like the real life situations, that I see, it's always situational.
Mhm.
In the beginning of this conversation, we kind of talked about this different types of projects, different type of customer. What are they looking for? If
Mhm.
somebody calls me, and I'll use a common example. Maybe we get an elderly lady, widower, whatever it may be. Hey, I kind of got a couple days of honey-do stuff around the house I need done. I mean, that's not something I'm going to sit there and write up a 10-page contract to go do, right? And obviously,
Right.
I think that's kind of common sense and
Mhm.
probably not a reasonable expectation. But at a bare minimum, what our company does is, hey, somebody calls me, they can, and this is a tip for any contractor maybe listening. I've learned through the years, a lot of people will waste your time. Both sides. Contractors will waste your time, customers will waste your time. So I've tried, as part of the systems we've built, to eliminate as much time wasting as possible. And part of that is setting clear expectations on this first couple conversations. So using that little old lady example, she calls me, say, "Hey, I got a couple days of work." I'm going to say, "Hey, based on what you're describing, it sounds like this is probably a day or two of labor. Maybe it's one, maybe it's two guys, whatever it may be. Um, Something like this is probably something we would just bill you for the time and material. So I'm going to say it's going to take 16 man hours. It may take 12. It may take 18. But as we work through the process, we'll kind of keep you updated with what we're doing if we run into any complications. And it's going to be as simple as that, right? And we're going to send somebody, we're going to do the work, and we're going to bill them. And obviously, at that point, we're probably talking hundreds or maybe low, $1,000, $2,000 tops. We're not talking tens of thousands of dollars, and that can be something that we put on a simple invoice. And obviously, they hopefully pay it in a timely manner, which is kind of spelled out on our very simple invoicing system. Now, if we're getting into, like you mentioned, a large project, where we're going to be on this for weeks or months and it's tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, yes, that's when we're going to roll out more of our we have a kind of a template that we use for a more complicated contract with timelines and payments and draw schedules and things like that. But any other kind of general thoughts you have on obviously those range of potential projects that people could run into?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I mean, you don't need to to take out a bazooka to kill an ant, right? So yeah, I mean, on those smaller jobs, I think it's usually enough to have like a scope and a price and some basic, at least for the contractor's protection, some sort of payment terms, interest that will accrue if it's late, or the right to get attorney's fees if you have to go collect it. Unfortunately, that kind of stuff to protect you on the contractor side of things. But yeah, as the project gets more complicated, more expensive, and longer term, that's when the contract should definitely be beefed up proportionally.
So, I mean, obviously, this is going to be very situational, but I've
Mhm.
ran into this a couple times. Generally speaking, in your market, at what point would it make sense for either a homeowner and or a contractor to take something to court? Like, what is kind of your
Mm.
threshold in your practice?
In our practice, the threshold is about $50,000 to $75,000.
Oh,
So anything smaller than that, the attorneys that represent, contractors or owners, I mean, we are hourly rate attorneys, and this is a specialization, so it's not an inexpensive hourly rate.
hmm,
So it'll easily cost, tens of thousands of dollars to fight these things.
ooh,
So it's often not worth really going into court for, for less than that. Now, you know, doesn't, but I always tell these people it takes two people to come to an agreement and only one to decide there's going to be a war. So if you've got one side that is really hell-bent on getting into court and suing, whether it's the contractor or the owner, I mean, the other side is in it, and it's something you obviously need to defend if you've been sued by the other side. You can't just ignore it. So you're kind of in it. And so as a result, there's a very real conversation I have to have with clients at the very beginning of sometimes if they've been sued over $25,000, no matter how much they are unhappy with and hate the other side and think they're right and the other guy's wrong, your bottom line, if that's what you're concerned about, is usually best served by striking a deal and getting it resolved, even if you got to pay more money than you originally ever thought you wanted to, just to get rid of it. So yeah, but I mean, when you're talking about certain types of litigation involving construction defects on like a single family home, custom single family home where there could be a lot of defects, I mean, it can cost you a couple $100,000 to litigate that all the way to
Mhm.
trial. So you need to have, damages that are in the, half a million mark to make it
Makes
worthwhile
sense.
in my
Yeah.
mind. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and using that example, is there a case? And obviously, I'm assuming this is going to be
Mhm.
jurisdictional
Sure.
specific and state specific. But is there a case where, let's say, I'm your client, I am suing a contractor that
Mhm.
you know owes me $100,000 in my opinion?
Yeah.
Is there a case where we could take that to trial and win, and they have to pay my legal fees, or is that unlikely?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So every state is different. At least here in Florida, the default rule is that everyone is responsible for their own attorney's fees, except
Mm,
in two instances. One is if the contract that you have with the other party that's been breached has a provision in it that says, "Hey, if we have to litigate this, the prevailing party is going to be awarded their fees from the non-prevailing party."
mhm.
Or if there's a statute on the books in Florida that has similar language, the construction lien law happens to be one of those. Now, practically speaking, you're still paying your lawyer along the way. And if you
And
can
hoping to win.
handle hoping to win, and if you can
Yeah.
handle that barrage of legal fees and
Right.
get to the end and win and get awarded, then yes, the court can award you your fees if you've prevailed on top of everything else. And if the other side is not collectible, then you've wasted a lot of time and money. It's not like you've usually
Yeah.
there's usually an insurance company out there writing a check on a breach of contract case. I mean, that's generally not what insurance covers for. So
Yeah.
so that's a big risk for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'd love to give just a brief real life example, because I think this is important for people to understand. And honestly, the
Mhm.
number you gave was even higher than anticipated. I thought you were going to start with 10, 20, $30,000. So your advice is even higher than some of the advice I've gotten directly from
Yeah,
local attorneys. But
yeah,
the very first contractor I hired who kind of scammed me for about $3,500, which may not sound like a lot to today. This is almost 10 years ago, but at the time it was like all the money that I could have ever imagined in the world. This was like
yeah,
somebody stabbed me in the heart. I mean, that's what it felt like when this happened, right? And so I called a couple attorneys, and they're like, yeah, dude, this is going to cost you 10 grand to take this guy to court if you win. And they're like, and the fact that he's scamming you, it tells me that he probably doesn't have any assets. He probably doesn't have any income. He probably doesn't file taxes. I kind of give some background on this guy. And I actually used to be a cop, and this guy even knew I was a cop, and he still scammed me. So it was like they're like, yeah, like in the context of everything you're describing, it's like the reality is even if you win, which isn't guaranteed, obviously, you're going to spend way more money fighting this guy than you could ever get back from him. And even if you did, it would take you a lifetime to get this money back. So it's like basically their advice was, suck it up and move on. And I kind of got that advice from a couple
yeah,
attorneys. So,
yeah.
and unfortunately, I've had it happen a few times with customers who didn't pay and with contractors who didn't pay. So,
Right. Yeah.
um, yeah,
It's usually litigation is kind of a battle of attrition. It's not always justice isn't really served often in
yeah,
this kind of thing, and it's really a matter of who can kind of bear the brunt of affording it more. And yeah, so there's got to be look, but emotions play a part of it. And there's very often it's the principle of it. I want to sue on I don't want this contractor to do that to anybody else.
hmm
Really? Is that super important to you? Like how important? Like is it
yeah,
important to spend 50,000 in attorney's fees to make sure he doesn't do this to somebody else? Generally it isn't. And
yeah, yeah,
I've seen enough times of saying with the client, okay, let's go, let's do it. And then after a few of my bills, they're like, well, I don't know, this is it's kind of got expensive quick. Yeah, well,
yeah,
now
yeah.
I have more important a more in depth conversation on the front end to make sure they're going into it with eyes open.
Man, yeah, that's no, that's yeah, that's great. Okay, so as we run up here on time, a couple
Yeah.
of things I did want to just add, kind of general advice and
Mhm.
why don't you start with maybe some general advice for the contractor side of these
Sure.
potential issues?
Yeah, and I think again, it all starts with communication. It really
Mhm.
look as the contractor, you're in a unique position, right? I mean, you're doing this every day, right? This is your job. You're used to doing jobs like this. For some of your customers, it might be the only job like this they ever do
Mhm.
in their lifetime, right? And so, I feel as a lawyer, I'm in a similar situation. Not everyone needs a lawyer, especially with what I do. But when you need me and you're coming to me, you're looking to me to show you what how to work with a lawyer, right? How to have legal services, how to be a client. And so it's kind of my job to kind of be the tour guide and show you and explain to you and teach you what to expect through the process when you hire my firm. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what will happen next. Here's what the process looks like. Contractors are in a similar situation for owners who may not do this very often, and it's an immediate opportunity to establish trust and credibility with the client. And so if you can demonstrate those things up front, I think it'll improve your closing rate, right? How many of these jobs you're actually signing, because the people want to do business with people they like and trust, and that's an immediate opportunity to recognize you're in a better position of knowledge than they are. So to me, that's a super important thing for contractors to keep in mind that not a lot of them, I think, do.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Couldn't agree more. And
Yeah.
I do have a couple quick things I'll add, but before we do that,
Hmm.
any other general thoughts, general tips, or feedback for maybe real estate investors or customers who are looking
Yeah.
to hire their next contractor?
Yeah, certainly don't ignore those red flags. Do some thorough background search, especially, I mean, if you're in a particular market and you're going to be doing this repeatedly, you're going to want to develop these relationships, right? You're
Yeah,
going to want to find the people who are really going to do the good job for you. So once you put in the work to find the right person, hopefully you only have to do that once, and then you can have them work on job after job at property after property for you. But yeah, keep in mind, I guess, as you mature as an investor, right? Like you said, like there's the right types of people for the right types of jobs. Try to align those as best you can, and understand that you still need to pay a lot of attention to what's going on as the work is happening.
yeah. Sorry, I think my dogs are going nuts.
Nah, that's all right. That's all right.
Yeah. I mean, just a couple final thoughts. From my perspective on this
Yeah.
conversation, it's like, from the contractor side, one lesson I have unfortunately had to learn over and over and over is that and you mentioned this many times throughout this conversation, but it's like when you communicate clearly with people and you set expectations up front, that solves 95% of your problem. Because what I see happen a lot, and again, I'm not perfect. I've made these same mistakes myself in my business, is we want to say yes to everybody. We want to say yes to budgets. We want to say yes to people's prices, to their timelines. And I think the default, kind of human element in us wants to make people happy. What ends up happening though is when you overpromise and underdeliver, which is a very common theme in the trades and construction, everybody's unhappy. You're miserable because you're chasing all these jobs around trying to keep your customer happy, and it's almost like whoever's screaming at you the most is the one you're trying to deal with that day or whatever it may be. Um, and same with pricing, right? And I will say that the last 4 years have been an anomaly. The last 5 years have been an anomaly where if I'm bidding a job a year out, I'm telling people straight up, I have no idea what stuff's going to cost in a year because every time I try to tell you what I think, I'm wrong. I mean, every single time. I mean, there's so especially now with tariffs, right? We're kind of running into another uncertainty in the market where we're estimating projects that are 6 months, 9 months, a year out, and I'm telling them, and some of these are our own projects, but it's like I have no idea. If lumber doubles in price, quadruples in price, which is a possibility, clearly lumber is going to be a lot more expensive than it is today, right? So the moral of this though is that as a contractor, as a business owner, we have to try to set very clear expectations, very clear communication, and be honest with people. I mean, be willing to be humble and be honest and tell people when you don't know the answer to something. Because I feel like a lot of contractors, especially now as the labor market's starting to tighten, at least in my market, and there's less work and there's more people looking for work, people tend to get a little bit more aggressive and I don't want to say greedy, but they get sort of that back, they feel like their backs against the wall. And maybe they're going to make some promises they can't keep, or they're going to, overpromise and underdeliver, like I mentioned. So I think you just have to be really cautious as a consumer and as a contractor in this market we're in, because we're in some volatility. There could be labor shortages. There could be a shortage of work if people start downsizing, downscaling in the economy. And again, with the price uncertainty, to me, if any contractors guarantee you any price 30 days out or more, they probably don't know what they're talking about. That would be a red flag to me today, given all the
Yeah.
volatility we're in. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, those are just kind of general thoughts of what I'm seeing right now and today, and some of the mistakes I've made in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think those are all really solid points, for sure, from the contractors end of it, definitely.
All right. Well, Andy, I know we're running up on time here. Any other final thoughts that you want to leave us with before we go?
No, I mean, just simply, it's these projects are not as simple as they seem. They're very serious investments for a lot of people. You should, treat it like it, and definitely, take your time to make the right decision on people. So that's probably about it. But I've been really happy to meet with you and talk to your audience about all this.
Yeah,
It's
I
been a lot
mean,
of fun.
I was hoping we'd solve all the construction and legal issues that ever existed in the last 45 minutes. But if we did not, maybe we'll have to do a part
Right.
two conversation another time. And my last question for you today, Andy, is where can our best ever listeners connect with you and find out more about your business? Obviously, certainly if they're in your Florida market as well.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so for sure. So yeah, on the internet, Wyman Legal Solutions with an S at the end.com is our website. Have a whole lot of information and resources on there for everybody. They could call us here at the office at 561-361-8700. And we've got a full team of people here who are more than eager to help everybody out.
Well, very good. I hope for our listeners' sake they don't have to call you, but if nothing else, I hope they learned something from you or from your
Yes,
resources online. So, Andy, thank you
exactly.
again so much for your time
All
today.
right, Joe.
I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Joe. So did I. Appreciate it.
Best ever listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review and share this with someone else who could value from it. Make sure you're following and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any. Thank you all for listening. Have a best ever day.